The train announced itself long before it arrived. Evelyn Carter heard the whistle from somewhere deep in the valley, a long, mournful sound that rolled across the flatlands and rattled the windows of the small depot at Red Hollow. She had been sitting rigid on the wooden bench inside for the past 20 minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her trunk stowed neatly against the wall beside her. She had not slept well. She had not slept well in 3 nights, not since the train pulled out of St. Louis with her aboard, and her old life receding behind her like something she'd cut loose deliberately. She told herself the sleeplessness was excitement. She'd told herself a lot of things over the past several months. The depot agent, a round man with a mustache that didn't quite meet in the middle, had glanced at her twice already with the careful look of someone who recognized a situation developing and wanted no part of it. Evelyn had offered him a small, composed smile both times. She was good at composed smiles. She had been practicing them since she was 12 years old. When the train groaned to a stop along the platform and the steam billowed out in great rolling clouds, Evelyn stood, smoothed the front of her skirt, and walked outside. The platform was made of weathered pine planks. There were 3 other people waiting, a man collecting a freight crate, a woman in a heavy shawl who immediately embraced a younger woman who stepped off the passenger car, and a teenage boy who seemed to be there for no reason anyone could explain. None of them were Warren Aldridge. Evelyn stood at the edge of the platform and waited. The passengers filed past her. A conductor helped an older gentleman with his baggage. The freight crate was dragged across the planks with a grinding sound. The mother and daughter held each other and cried a little. The teenage boy wandered off toward the street. The engine gave one last exhalation of steam, and then everything went quiet. She waited another 10 minutes before going back inside to speak to the depot agent. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm expecting someone to meet me. Warren Aldridge, do you know if he's been in today?" The agent's expression shifted in a way she didn't like. Something tightened behind his eyes. He looked at her trunk, and then back at her face, and then down at his ledger. "You'd be the lady from St. Louis," he said. It wasn't a question. "I would be," Evelyn said. He set his pen down with more care than the moment required. "Miss, I'm sorry, I don't have your name." "Carter. Evelyn Carter." "Miss Carter." He cleared his throat. "Mr. Aldridge came in to arrange for your trunk to be held. About 5 days ago. He left town. The day after he came in here. Far as anyone can tell, he's not coming back." Evelyn did not move. She was aware distantly of her own heartbeat, of the sound of a horse somewhere outside, of the way the afternoon light came in through the grimy depot window and fell across the floor in long, pale stripes. "I see," she said. "I'm real sorry, Miss Carter. Did he leave any message? A letter?" "No, ma'am." She nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they are buying time for their thoughts to catch up to their body. Then she picked up her reticule, thanked the agent. She thanked him, which she recognized even then as somewhat absurd, and walked back out onto the platform. She stood there in the afternoon sun for a long moment. Red Hollow spread out before her in the way frontier towns always did. A main street of necessity rather than charm, a livery at one end and a general store at the other, a handful of side streets, a saloon that needed paint, and a scattering of houses pushing outward from the center like an afterthought. The mountains sat behind all of it in a long blue line. They were beautiful, she noted. That was something. She had $43.60. She had a trunk of clothes, 2 books, a sewing kit, and a small framed photograph of her mother. She had no family to wire. She had no address in St. Louis to go back to. She had given up her room, her position at the dress shop, her small and manageable and profoundly unsatisfying life. All of it, to come here. She had come here for a man who had not even written a letter. For a moment, just one, she felt the full weight of it pressed down on her chest like something physical. It was humiliation, mostly. Not grief. Not yet. Warren Aldridge had written her charming letters for 4 months. He had described his land, his prospects, his loneliness. He had been careful and deliberate, and she had believed him because she had wanted to, and because she was 31 years old and the dress shop was becoming a kind of coffin she could see herself dying in. She breathed in. She breathed out. She picked up her trunk. It was heavy, and she had to drag it, and she walked off the platform toward town. The woman at the boarding house, whose name was Mrs. Dora Fitch, had the particular skill of making sympathy sound like its opposite. "Well," she said, after Evelyn explained her situation in as few words as possible, "you're not the first, I suppose. Men advertise for wives like they're advertising for livestock, and then they change their mind. No offense meant." "None taken," Evelyn said, though some was. "I have a room, $2 a week, meals included. It's small. I'll take it." The room was, in fact, small. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window overlooking a back alley, and a hook on the wall for clothes. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed after Mrs. Fitch left, and she did the arithmetic again in her head. $43.60, $2 a week. She had approximately 20 weeks before she had nothing. Less if she needed other things. She needed other things. She needed a plan. She was in the middle of constructing one. Specifically, she was thinking about the general store and whether they might need help when she heard the sound. It came from the alley below her window. At first she thought it was an animal, which was not unusual in frontier towns. Then it resolved itself into something else. A child, crying with that particular quality that suggested they had been crying for a while and were getting tired but couldn't stop. Evelyn went to the window. There was a boy in the alley, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, sitting against the wall of the building with his knees drawn up and his face buried in his arms. He was wearing clothes that had once been clean. He was alone. She didn't think about it much. She went downstairs. The back door of the boarding house opened onto the alley, and when Evelyn stepped out and the boy heard her footsteps, his head came up fast, a wild, startled movement, like an animal expecting trouble. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and a running nose, and a face that had the particular exhaustion of a child who had been left to manage grief alone. Then something changed in his expression. It was instantaneous and devastating. His face crumpled, and before Evelyn had any idea what was happening, he launched himself off the ground and flung his arms around her waist and pressed his face into her skirt and sobbed. She stood there for a moment, completely still, her hands at her sides. Then she put her arms around him and held on. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey now. It's all right." "Mama," the boy said into her skirt, and the word hit her somewhere behind the sternum. "Mama." She didn't correct him. Not right then. She just held him and let him cry, standing in the alley behind Mrs. Fitch's boarding house in the town she had arrived in with nothing, while the mountains sat blue and silent in the distance. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 5 years old. This came out gradually, in the way information comes from a child who has been frightened, in pieces, some of them not quite in order, some of them repeated. He had gone to the market with his father. He had gotten turned around looking at something. He had walked for a while trying to find his father, and then he couldn't find him, and he'd gotten scared, and he had hidden in the alley. "Your father will be looking for you," Evelyn told him. They were sitting on the back step of the boarding house now, side by side. She had produced a handkerchief, and he had used it thoroughly. "What's his name?" "Papa." "His other name, the name people call him." Daniel thought about this. "Cole," he said. "Cole Mercer." "All right. And do you know where you live? What direction from town?" He pointed. It was a fairly confident point for a child who'd just been lost. "Past the creek. There's a big rock shaped like a bird." "Okay." Evelyn stood up. "Let's go find your papa then." She took his hand and they went around to the main street. She had not been in Red Hollow for more than 2 hours, and she already knew it was a small enough town that finding someone should not be difficult. She was right. They had walked half a block before she heard the voice. "Daniel?" It came from across the street. The man who said it was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a hat that had seen a few years of weather. He was already moving toward them with the controlled urgency of someone who had been trying very hard not to panic. When he reached them, he crouched down in front of the boy and gripped his shoulders. "I've been looking everywhere for you. I told you to stay close." "I got lost," Daniel said, "but the lady found me." Cole Mercer looked up at Evelyn. He had a hard face, not unkind, but weathered in a way that suggested it hadn't smiled easily in some time. There were shadows under his eyes. He looked like a man who had been running on something other than sleep for a while. "Thank you," he said. He said it plainly, without the elaborate gratitude some people performed. It felt like he meant it. "He was in the alley behind Mrs. Fitch's," Evelyn said. He wasn't hurt, just frightened. Cole got back to his feet. He was studying her. Not rudely, but with the direct attention of someone who was trying to place her. I don't think I've seen you before. I only arrived today. She paused. There was no reason not to say it. On the afternoon train. Something shifted in his expression. She watched him arrive at the conclusion, watched him decide not to say anything about it. You staying at Fitch's? For now, he nodded. There was the beat of silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. Daniel had taken hold of Evelyn's hand again, apparently having decided this was acceptable without consultation. I owe you, Cole said. You don't. I do. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small coin. Evelyn shook her head. Put that away, she said. Please. He looked at her for a moment, then he put the coin back. Daniel tugged at her hand. Are you going to be here tomorrow? Daniel, his father said, I just want to know. Evelyn looked down at him. He was watching her with that particular intensity that small children have, the kind that assumes the world will give them an honest answer. I don't know yet, she said. Well, the town did not take long to form an opinion. By the next morning, Red Hollow knew about Evelyn Carter. It was that kind of town, not malicious exactly, but small and bored with itself, and possessed of the particular interest in other people's troubles that develops when entertainment is scarce. The depot agent had told someone, or someone had been watching the platform, or both. She felt it when she went to the general store that morning. The woman behind the counter was polite to the edge of pity, which was almost worse than rudeness. Two women on the street stopped talking when she passed and resumed when she was 20 feet beyond them. A man outside the saloon looked at her with the frank appraisal of someone calculating odds. The owner of the general store, a man named Petty, lean and careful with money, told her regretfully that he had no positions available. The restaurant at the north end of Maine told her the same. The dressmaker, who occupied a narrow storefront between the barber shop and an empty building, did not even let her finish before explaining that things were slow. Evelyn walked back toward Mrs. Fitch's with the arithmetic running in her head again, sharper now. She was not prone to despair. She had grown up in a house where despair was a luxury nobody could afford, but she understood her situation clearly. A woman alone in a frontier town, abandoned before she'd even been received, with no local connections and money draining daily. This was not a position that improved on its own. She was thinking about this standing outside the boarding house when a wagon pulled up. Cole Mercer sat on the seat. Daniel was beside him. The boy was waving before the wagon had fully stopped. Pa said we're going to ask you something, Daniel announced. Cole looked at him briefly. I said we might. You said we were going to. Cole looked back at Evelyn. He had his hat in his hands now, a gesture that seemed almost automatic, as if propriety had been installed in him somewhere and operated independently of his mood. I have a proposition, he said. It might be nothing you're interested in. Tell me, Evelyn said. He did. He explained it with the awkward economy of a man who had rehearsed something and was now uncertain of the rehearsal. His ranch was 3 miles out. He had been managing alone since his wife died a year and a half ago, Daniel's mother Sarah gone in the winter of a fever that had come fast and left no time for anything. He had a housekeeper for a while, a woman from town, but she'd moved on in the spring. The house was in a state. Daniel needed someone present. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and the ranch required him outside most of the day. I'm not looking for anything but honest work, Evelyn said carefully, because she had read enough of this situation to know what needed to be said plainly. That's all I'm offering, Cole said, and he said it without defensiveness or qualification, which she respected. What does it pay? He named a figure. It was not generous, but it was fair for what he was describing, and fair was what she needed right now. She thought about the dressmaker. She thought about Mr. Petty. She thought about 20 weeks. All right, she said. Daniel pumped his fist in a way that was so purely childlike she almost laughed. The ranch was called the Mercer Place, not because Cole had named it anything, but because that was what people called it. It occupied a stretch of land backed up against the foothills, with a creek running along the south edge and a line of cottonwoods that turned gold in the fall. The main house was a 2-story structure that had started with ambition and been added to practically as needs arose, so that it gave the impression of a building making decisions as it went along. The inside was in the condition of a place that had been functional rather than cared for. Not filthy. Cole was not that kind of man. But neglected in the specific ways that happen when nobody has had the time or the energy or the heart for the details. Curtains that had not been washed since winter. A pantry organized according to convenience rather than any coherent system. A parlor with a chair that someone had dragged to the window and left there, turned toward the mountains, which Evelyn understood immediately without being told. Daniel showed her everything with the enthusiasm of a child who has rarely had a captive audience. The barn with its 3 horses and the bad-tempered older one who bit. The kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to weed. The creek, which he declared to be very good for frogs. There used to be curtains with flowers on them, he told her in the kitchen. Mama put them up. Papa took them down after. Daniel, Cole said from the doorway, I'm just telling her. You're telling her things that aren't any of her business. Evelyn turned to face him. It's all right, she said. He's not telling me anything I couldn't figure out on my own. Cole looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he turned and went back outside. Is Pa mad? Daniel asked. No, Evelyn said, though she was not entirely sure. He's just... She searched for the word. Private. Daniel nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. He cries sometimes, he said, lowering his voice to the conspiratorial register of children sharing important information. At night. He thinks I can't hear, but I can. Evelyn looked at the boy. 5 years old, carrying a knowledge he shouldn't have to carry yet. Your papa loves you very much, she said. I know. He said it simply, as a fact rather than a comfort. Are you going to make dinner? Oh, she made dinner. Was not a triumph. The pantry offered limited options, and she was working with a wood stove that had some opinions about how it wanted to operate. But it was hot and complete, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table and ate it. And for Evelyn, that act alone felt like something solid after a day of uncertainty. Cole ate without many words, which she was beginning to understand was his default. Daniel compensated for this comprehensively, covering topics including, but not limited to, the frog situation at the creek, the specific grievances he had against a boy named Thomas at the schoolhouse, whether or not the bad-tempered horse understood human speech, and a lengthy description of a dream he'd had that seemed to involve a castle and a talking sheep. Evelyn listened and asked questions at the right moments, and Cole watched this happen from across the table with an expression she was starting to read. Not quite wonder, but something in that direction. Surprise, maybe. At the ease of it. When Daniel was in bed, a production that required 3 trips back downstairs for water, a forgotten toy, and one final question about whether frogs slept. Evelyn washed the dishes. Cole sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers, doing the math of a man who worked at it like it was something he could force into better numbers through concentration. After a while, he said without looking up, He talked more tonight than he has in 2 months. Evelyn kept washing. He's been holding it in. I know. It's not your fault, she said. You've been doing what you can. You don't know that. No, she agreed. Not yet. Silence settled. The lamp threw a small, warm circle of light. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch shifted and settled. Horses, insects, the creek somewhere in the distance. He thought you were his mother, Cole said. Earlier, when he ran to you in the alley. I know. He hasn't said her name in a month. Evelyn turned to look at him. He was still looking at the ledgers, but his pen had stopped moving. I'm not trying to be anything I'm not, she said carefully. I want to be clear about that. He looked up then. In the lamplight, he looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. I know, he said. I wasn't suggesting... He stopped. I just wanted you to know he's not... Another stop. He doesn't do that usually. He was frightened and he needed someone, Evelyn said simply. I was there. Cole nodded once. He looked back at the ledgers. Evelyn went back to the dishes. What was she like? Evelyn asked after a moment. It was maybe not her place to ask. She asked anyway. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, impossible to make angry, stubborn about everything, laughed at things that weren't funny until you started thinking they were. He said it like he was reading from a list he'd made. like he'd put the description somewhere external so he wouldn't have to carry it internally all the time. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Evelyn said. She was. The days established their own rhythm quickly, the way days in working places do. Evelyn was up before Daniel, which meant she was up before most of the light. She started the stove, which she was learning to manage with the patience it required. She made coffee. Cole was already outside by then, had been since before she woke. She could hear the ranch starting up, the sounds of the barn, the horses. He came in at breakfast and at the noon meal if he wasn't too far out, and at supper without exception, and those were the points of contact 3 times a day, around which everything else orbited. She cleaned systematically, not frantically. She wasn't trying to erase Sarah Mercer from the house. She understood it wasn't hers to erase anything from. But there was a difference between clean and merely not filthy, and she worked her way from room to room with the efficiency of someone who had been managing a household since she was 14. She washed the curtains. Not Sarah's flower curtains. Cole had apparently taken those down and put them somewhere, and she left that alone entirely. But the kitchen curtains, plain cotton, went into the tub and came out cleaner. She organized the pantry with logic rather than urgency. She found a patch of the kitchen garden that was salvageable and began working on it in the afternoons while Daniel conducted his frog research at the creek. Not the whole garden, some of it was past recovery for the season, but enough to yield something by fall. Daniel attached himself to her with the absolute commitment of a child who has decided someone is safe. He helped with things in the focused, unhelpful way of small children helping, measuring out flour with deep seriousness, holding things she hadn't asked to be held, providing ongoing commentary on the quality of her decisions. She let him. She let him underfoot and in the way and asking questions because she understood that his presence there was not an intrusion but a kind of trust, the kind that children extend all at once and then watch to see what you do with it. One afternoon, near the end of the first week, she was teaching him to make biscuits. His were lopsided and slightly gray from insufficient flour removal from his hands, and she told him honestly that they were the best biscuits she had seen all week, which was technically true, as they were the only biscuits she had seen all week. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. "I'm working here," she said. "That's the plan." "But stay," he said. "Like always." She looked at him, this small person with his floury hands and his direct eyes. "1 week at a time," she said. "That's how I know how to do things." He considered this. "Okay," he said, and went back to his biscuit with renewed focus. Cole came in from the barn as the biscuits were coming out. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the table, Daniel's flour-dusted face, the lopsided biscuits, Evelyn's hand still holding the pan. And something moved across his expression, complicated and brief, before he pulled his boots off and came inside. "Those mine?" he asked Daniel, pointing at the catastrophic biscuits. "I made them," Daniel said proudly. "They're a little bumpy." "Bumpy's fine," Cole said, and sat down, and ate one without complaint. And that small, unremarkable moment was, Evelyn thought, probably the most real thing that had happened to her since she stepped off the train. The talk in town was something she lived with rather than ignored. She went in on Saturdays for supplies, and she could feel the assessment in it. Women outside the dressmakers, the men at the general store. That particular quality of attention that frontier towns gave to situations that defied easy category. A woman alone, working on a widower's ranch. It wasn't scandalous exactly, but it was interesting, and interesting was currency in a town that had little enough of it. Mrs. Fitch, who she occasionally saw at the market, offered her observations freely and without request. "People are wondering," she said one Saturday, which was Mrs. Fitch's way of saying she was wondering. "They're welcome to," Evelyn said pleasantly. "You know how people get." "I do. Just thought you ought to be aware." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said, and moved on to the flour. She understood that her situation was legible to the town in a particular way. Arrived for one man, now working for another, and that the interpretation being applied to it was probably the least charitable available. She could not control the interpretation. She could control what she did and how she did it, and she kept doing it. Cole was not unaware of the talk. She could tell by the way he was careful about certain things, always making sure Mrs. Fitch or another woman from town saw them together in town settings, always maintaining the formal distance of an employer and employee in public, always referring to her as Miss Carter, where it might be heard. It was not coldness. It was protection, for her primarily, which she understood, and for Daniel secondarily, and for himself last of all, which seemed to be his general order of priorities. There was one morning, about 3 weeks in, when the formality slipped a little. She was in the kitchen garden, fighting with a section that had compacted badly, when Cole came around the side of the house and stopped. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Attempting to rehabilitate this row," she said. The implement she was using was not quite the right tool for the job, because the right tool for the job was apparently missing from the shed. "That's not going to work." "I'm aware. Do you have a smaller spade?" "Not that I know of." "Then I'm going to make this one work." He watched her for a moment. Then he went to the shed and came back with something she hadn't seen. He crouched down at the other end of the row and began breaking the soil from that direction. They worked toward each other for about 20 minutes without saying much, which was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. When they met in the middle and the row was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at what they'd accomplished. "Sarah could never get this section to grow anything," he said. It seemed to come out of somewhere he hadn't meant it to come from. She didn't say anything for a moment. "What did she try?" Evelyn asked. "Everything. She had ideas about it." His voice was level but careful. "I told her it was the drainage. She said it was me being pessimistic." "Was she right?" He almost smiled. It was a very brief, incomplete thing, but it was there. Usually. He got up, dusted his hands, and went back to the barn without ceremony. Evelyn looked at the row they'd broken together, the dark turned earth, and felt something she hadn't expected, the uncomplicated satisfaction of a problem solved in good company. Deb. She had been at the ranch for 5 weeks when the telegram arrived. Cole brought it in from town without comment and set it on the kitchen table. Her name was on it. She looked at it for a moment. Telegrams had never been good news in her experience, and then opened it. "Arriving Friday, we have matters to discuss. W. Aldridge." She read it twice. Then she set it down. She sat. Cole had not moved from the doorway. He had the look of a man who was trying to give her privacy and also couldn't quite leave. "Who's W. Aldridge?" he asked. Evelyn folded the telegram with steady hands. "The man I came here to marry," she said. Cole was quiet. "He left before I arrived," she said. "It appears he's decided to come back." "What does he want?" "I don't know yet." She put the telegram in her apron pocket. "But I don't think it's going to be pleasant." Daniel came in from outside, tracking mud, beginning a question about lunch, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary mechanics of the day. But as Evelyn moved around the kitchen and Cole went to clean up, and the afternoon settled over the ranch in its usual way, she was aware of the paper in her pocket like a stone. She knew Warren Aldridge's type. She had not always known it, but she knew it now, in the way you know things after they have already cost you something. He had written careful letters, measured and charming, and she had believed them because she had wanted a life and he had offered one. What she understood now, that she had not understood then, was that he hadn't been describing a life. He had been constructing one on paper to see what it would attract. The question was what he wanted now, and whatever it was, she already knew she was not going to give it to him. She stirred the pot on the stove. Daniel sat at the table and told her about the frogs. The afternoon light came through the window and fell in the same pale stripes it always did. She was still here. That was something. But Friday came in cool and bright. Evelyn was at the general store when Warren Aldridge rode into Red Hollow. She didn't recognize him immediately. She had only one photograph, taken at an angle, and photographs lied in the frontier era about as reliably as everything else. But he rode with the confidence of a man who expected to be noticed, and Red Hollow noticed him, and someone outside the store said the name, and she looked up. He was perhaps 40, with good clothes and a well-fed look, and the particular ease of a man who had always found the world arranged conveniently for him. He scanned the street in the way a man scans a room he owns, and when his eyes found her standing outside the general store with a bag of flour, he stopped his horse and looked at her with an expression she could only describe as satisfied. "Miss Carter," he said. He smiled. It was a practiced smile, all surface. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. He dismounted. He was still smiling. "I was hoping to find you here. I understand you've been staying on in town." Admirable persistence. He said admirable persistence, like it was a quality he'd decided to find charming rather than troublesome. I have been working, she said. Yes. Something shifted slightly in his expression, the smile staying but the warmth behind it rearranging. I heard. We'll talk about that. I have some things to explain to you, and I think once you hear them, you'll understand. I'd be very interested in your explanation, Evelyn said, and she was careful to keep her voice perfectly even, because she had learned a long time ago that the most unsettling thing you could do to a man who expected a scene was to give him composure instead. Dinner tonight, he said. At the restaurant. My treat. We can settle everything. She looked at him for a moment. Behind his right shoulder, she could see Mrs. Fitch watching from across the street. She could see the general store clerk visible through the window. All right, she said. Tonight. She walked back to the ranch with the flour and an extremely clear idea of what Warren Aldridge was going to say and what she was going to have to decide about it. Cole was fixing the fence at the east pasture when she got back. She found him there not because she was looking for him, but because she needed to tell someone, and he was the one she told things to now, she realized, without quite having decided to. He's here, she said. Cole straightened. He looked at her for a moment. And? He wants to have dinner, to explain himself. She paused. I said yes. Why? Because I want to hear what he says, and because... She stopped. Because why? Because if I know what he wants, I know what I'm dealing with. She looked at the fence, the east pasture, the mountains beyond. He's not going to be honest about it. Men like him rarely are. But you can tell what someone actually wants by how they dress up the asking. Cole looked at her with that expression she had started to categorize, the one that suggested she had said something he hadn't expected from the direction she'd come from. He turned back to the fence and drove a nail in with 2 clean strokes. You need anything? He asked. I don't think so, she said. Not yet. She walked back to the house, and behind her she heard him drive another nail, and the sound of it was steady and ordinary and good. Partet. Dinner at the Red Hollow restaurant was Warren Aldridge at his most polished, which was to say that it was very polished indeed and revealed in its polish almost everything she needed to know. He had a story. Of course he had a story. He had been called away urgently. Family matters, complicated financial matters, things she would not understand the details of, but that had required him to leave with no time to write. He was deeply sorry. He had come back as soon as he could. He wanted to make things right. You could have sent a telegram, Evelyn said. I know. You're right, I should have. He met her eyes and let contrition move across his face with the precision of someone who had practiced it. I have no excuse for that. No, she said. You don't. He refilled her water glass. He had good manners. She remembered that from the letters. Good manners, she had learned, were not the same as good character and were in fact sometimes employed in exactly inverse proportion to it. Evelyn, he said, and using her first name was itself a kind of move, a reclaiming of familiarity she hadn't offered. I want to start over. What I offered you still stands, the land, the house, all of it. I think we can still build something. She looked at him across the table. He was watching her with that satisfaction again, the same look he'd had on his horse when he spotted her, like something he'd calculated correctly. What happened to the land you described to me? She asked. Something flickered. I'm sorry? In your letters. You described land with a well and a house already built and 120 acres. You said you had a cattle operation established. She kept her voice curious rather than accusatory. What does the property actually look like, Mr. Aldridge? The flicker again, brief and quickly controlled. There have been some delays. In terms of the structures, the land is good land. The possibilities are everything I described. Possibilities, she said. Evelyn, I'm not going to marry you, she said. She said it plainly, without drama, in the same tone she'd said everything else. It sat on the table between them, and he looked at it for a moment. I understand you're upset, he said. I'm not upset. I'm clear. You came all this way and found the place empty, she said, and made a life in it anyway. I'm not going to go backward into something I don't want because you've decided it's convenient. He was quiet for a moment. He set his fork down very carefully. When he looked at her again, the practiced warmth had gone somewhere else, and what was underneath it was something colder and more calculated. "We have a contract," he said. "I was corresponding with a man who described a situation that does not appear to exist," she said. "That's not a contract. That's a deception." "They're illegal." "Then take it to the law," she said. "I'm not afraid of that." She said it because she believed it, and also because she had to. She picked up her glass of water and took a calm drink and set it down, and she was aware that her hand was perfectly steady, which she was grateful for. He looked at her for a long moment across the table. "You've changed," he said, "since those letters." "No," Evelyn said. "I've arrived." She stood up, thanked him for dinner because she had been raised to do that, and old habits didn't die even when everything else was uncertain, and she walked out of the restaurant and into the cool frontier night, and she did not look back. It was late when she returned to the ranch. The house was quiet. Daniel asleep, a lamp burning low in the front room. Cole was on the porch. She had not expected him to be awake. She was not sure what he was doing, not waiting, exactly. Sitting. She sat down in the other chair. They were quiet for a while with the night sounds around them. "How was dinner?" Cole asked. "Instructive." Another silence. "He's going to make trouble," she said. Not a question. Cole looked out at the dark. "I figured. I told him I wouldn't marry him. He mentioned a contract." "Do you have one?" "We wrote letters, that's all." Cole turned to look at her. In the low light, she could see the tiredness in him, the steady kind that didn't go away with sleep. "You going to be all right?" She thought about that honestly before she answered. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going back to something I don't choose." He nodded once. He had a way of receiving things she said, not commenting on them or building on them, just receiving them, which was its own kind of response. Inside, she could hear the house, the settling sounds of wood contracting in the cool, Daniel's even breathing from upstairs, the small, functional sounds of a home. She had not planned for this. She had planned for Warren Aldridge and the letters and the 120 acres. None of that existed. What existed was here. A ranch that needed work, a child who made her lopsided biscuits, a man who drove fence posts with 2 strokes and didn't say anything he didn't mean. She didn't know what came next. She had $43 originally, and now she had 2 months of wages and a room that was not a coffin and a job that felt like it mattered, 1 week at a time. That was still the only way she knew how to do things. But for the first time since she stepped off the train onto the empty platform, she was not afraid of the next week. Whatever Warren Aldridge was going to do, whatever came next, she would face it from here, from this porch, from this ground. She had chosen it. That made all the difference. She went inside, climbed the stairs, and let the sound of the house settle around her as she lay in the dark. Outside, the mountains sat in their long blue line, invisible now in the dark, but there, always there. Solid in the way only old and unmovable things can be. She was still here. That was enough for tonight. Warren Aldridge did not leave. That was the first thing Evelyn understood when she came into town the following Saturday and saw his horse tied outside the hotel. She had half expected him to ride out after their dinner. Men like him, she had assessed, generally preferred terrain where the ground was favorable, and she had made the ground at that dinner table as unfavorable as she knew how. But the horse was there, and then Warren was there, stepping out of the hotel with his good coat and his studied ease, and he tipped his hat at her across the street with the smile of a man who had made a decision she was not yet aware of. She kept walking, but she noted it. She noted everything. The week that followed had its surface of routine. Daniel and his biscuits, the kitchen garden gaining on itself, Cole coming in at meals with the quiet that was his normal weather. But underneath it, she was aware of Warren Aldridge sitting in Red Hollow like a splinter that hadn't worked its way out yet. She didn't know what he was doing there. She didn't know who he was talking to. In a town that size, the not knowing was its own kind of pressure, Cole noticed. He didn't say anything directly. That wasn't his way. But he had started coming back from town with an extra attentiveness to his expression, the kind of careful blankness that meant he was holding something in until he decided what to do with it. On Wednesday, he came in from town at midday, which he rarely did, and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man assembling words. Aldridge is talking to people, he said. Evelyn set down the spoon she'd been using. Daniel was outside. The kitchen was quiet. What kind of talking? She asked. The kind where he buys a man a drink and then has a conversation. Cole looked at the table. He's been in to see Judge Harlan, twice. She was quiet for a moment. Do you know what about? No, but he also talked to Petty at the general store, and to a man named Croatian who does some lawyering out of the back of his office. Cole looked up at her. Creighton's not much of a lawyer, but he's the only one in 40 miles. Evelyn turned back to the stove, not because she needed to attend to anything on it, but because she needed a moment with her back to the room. She breathed in slowly. She thought about the telegram. We have matters to discuss. She thought about the way Warren had said contract at dinner, quietly, deliberately, like placing a card on a table. He's going to do something formal, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what it looks like. She turned back around. What could he actually claim? We wrote letters. I came. He wasn't here. No ceremony, no agreement signed in front of witnesses. I don't know the law well enough, Cole said. And neither does he, probably. But he doesn't have to know it well. He just has to make enough noise that it gets complicated. He paused. And he has money. That changes how complicated things can get. She sat down across from him. They were at the kitchen table in the middle of the day, which was unusual enough that the unusualness of it sat between them like a third presence. He wants something, she said. It's not me specifically. It's not about the marriage anymore. That's not what this is. What is it then? She thought about the practiced smile, the satisfied look when he spotted her outside the general store, the way he'd said we have a contract, not with anger but with the particular tone of someone invoking a tool they'd prepared in advance. He's embarrassed, she said. He left town and everybody knew why he left, and now the woman he left is still here and doing fine without him. That bothers a man like him more than anything else would. She looked at the grain of the table. And then there's the other thing. What other thing? Something about the land he described. It doesn't exist the way he said it did. He was vague when I asked about it at dinner, but it was the vagueness of someone covering something up, not the vagueness of someone who doesn't remember the details. Cole was watching her carefully. He might be in some kind of trouble, she said. Financial maybe, or legal, I don't know. But men who come back to a situation they walked away from usually come back because they need something from it, not because they feel bad about leaving. The back door opened and Daniel came in with mud on his boots and a long, involved story about a frog that had apparently relocated, and the conversation dissolved into the practical. But Evelyn carried it with her through the rest of the afternoon, turning it over while she worked, checking it for angles she might have missed. She didn't find any, which meant she was probably right, and being right about Warren Aldridge was not a comfortable thing to be told. The document arrived on Friday. It was delivered by a boy from town, a teenager she didn't know, who handed it to her at the door and left without waiting for a response. She stood in the doorway and read it. It was not technically a legal summons. Creighton was not capable enough for a legal summons, apparently, but it was a formal-looking letter on good stationery, citing a prior agreement of intent between one Warren James Aldridge and one Evelyn Ruth Carter, alleging that said agreement constituted a binding promise of marriage under the laws of the territory, and requesting that Miss Carter present herself to discuss terms of compliance or face further legal proceedings. She read it twice. Then she went and found Cole. He was at the barn, working on a piece of harness that had broken in the morning. She handed him the letter, and he read it standing, which was how he read everything, as if sitting down for information was a luxury. When he was done, he handed it back. That's not a real legal document, he said. No, she agreed. But it's meant to look like one to someone who doesn't know the difference. What do you want to do? She folded the letter. She thought not for the first time about $43. She thought about Creighton, the part-time lawyer in the back of an office. She thought about Judge Harlan, who she did not know. I want to talk to someone who actually knows the law, she said. Is there anyone between here and the county seat who would know whether this means anything? Cole thought about it. There's a woman named Aldous in Brixton. She's a clerk for the circuit court. She's not a lawyer, but she knows the law better than most lawyers around here do. Brixton's a day's ride. Can you spare a day? He looked at the harness. I'll figure it out. She almost said you don't have to come, But she stopped herself because that was the kind of thing you said when you were trying to demonstrate independence, and what she actually needed was someone who knew the roads to Brixton. "Tomorrow?" she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They left before sunrise, which meant Daniel was still asleep, and Mrs. Holloway from the neighboring property had agreed to come sit with him for the day. Cole drove the wagon, and Evelyn sat beside him with the letter in her bag and the landscape opening up around them in the early morning light. It was the first time she had left Red Hollow since arriving, she realized. 2 months in a single town, which was longer than she had stayed anywhere since leaving St. Louis. The land looked different from a wagon moving through it, bigger, less contained, the sky doing things it didn't do when you were standing under a roof. Cole was quiet for the first hour, which suited her. She was composing arguments in her head, sorting what she knew from what she suspected, preparing for a conversation with someone she'd never met about a situation that should never have arisen. Around the first hour's end, Cole said, "How did you meet him?" "Aldridge." She glanced at him. He was watching the road, his hands easy on the rein. "An advertisement," she said, "in a St. Louis newspaper. He described himself as a landowner looking for a practical woman who wanted a real life in the West." She paused. It was more charming than that sounds. He had a way with words and letters. "You believed him?" "I wanted to," she said, which was the honest version. "I was 31 and working in a dress shop, and I had been there for 9 years. I knew exactly what the next 30 years looked like, and I didn't want them." She looked at the landscape rolling past. "That's not a good reason to believe someone, but it's the reason I had." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Sarah answered an advertisement too," he said. She looked at him. He was still watching the road, his expression the same careful neutral he used for things that mattered. "Did she?" Evelyn said. "Mine." He said it plainly. "I was 24. I'd had the land for 2 years, and I was—" He stopped, started again. "I was practical about it. I needed someone who could work. I said so in the advertisement. I didn't say anything charming." A pause. She answered it anyway. She said later she figured a man who was honest about being practical was more trustworthy than one who wrote pretty. She was right, Evelyn said. Usually was. His jaw moved slightly. "We had 6 years before she got sick. Daniel was 3. Evelyn looked at the road ahead of them. The mountains had shifted in the distance, showing a different face from this angle. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know." He said it the way he received things, directly, without deflection. "I'm not—" He paused, working out the words carefully. "I'm not the kind of man who talks about it easily, but I'm not talking about it for any reason other than that." "I didn't think you were," she said. They rode in silence for a while after that. It was a different quality of silence than their usual kitchen silences, more open, somehow, as if the larger space had given it room to expand. The horses moved steadily. The morning light turned from gray to gold. "She would have liked you," Cole said eventually, not looking at her. Evelyn did not know what to do with that. She sat with it for a moment, neither dismissing it nor leaning into it. "Tell me something about her," she said. "Something small." He thought about it. "She couldn't cook," he said. It was bad. Genuinely bad. Not in the way people say it when they're being modest. The first year we were married, I thought maybe I'd made a catastrophic error. Evelyn laughed. It came out before she could modulate it, and it was a real laugh, surprised and a little loud. Cole glanced at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but something that had been near smiling recently and remembered the feeling. "She got better," he said. "Eventually. Daniel still won't touch anything made with cornmeal because of a particular incident in his 2nd year of life." "That explains a few things," Evelyn said, still smiling. "She was extraordinary at other things," he said. "She could read people the way you'd read a map. She knew within 10 minutes whether someone was worth trusting. I never had that." He looked ahead at the road. "I just watch and wait and usually come to the same conclusion she'd have had immediately." "What's the conclusion about Aldridge?" Evelyn asked. "Same one you had," Cole said. "He wants something and he's not going to say what it is." Helena Aldis occupied a small office in the Brixton Courthouse Annex, a spare, well-organized room with more paper in it than the space seemed designed to hold. She was perhaps 50, gray-haired, with the kind of precise attention that came from years of watching lawyers say things that weren't quite accurate and learning to spot the gap. She read the letter carefully, turning it over once to check the back, then read it again. "This is not a legal document," she said. "That's what I thought," Evelyn said. "It's dressed like one. But there's no case number, no court seal, and the legal theory it's invoking, promise of marriage as binding contract, has been argued in territorial courts before, and the outcomes are inconsistent at best." She set it on the desk. "What was the nature of your correspondence with this man?" "Letters, 4 months of them. He described his property and his situation. I wrote back. He invited me to come west. I came." "Did you exchange any document signed by both parties? Any written agreement with witnesses?" "No." "Did money change hands?" "He offered to pay my train fare, but I declined. I paid for myself." Helena nodded slowly. "Then the foundation of his claim is weak. Personal letters describing intentions are not contracts, and frontier courts have generally been reluctant to enforce promise of marriage claims, particularly when the party claiming breach is the one who left." She looked at Evelyn with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was entirely clear. However, Evelyn repeated. "This depends heavily on the judge. Harlan is—" Helena paused with the care of a woman who worked around judges and had opinions about them. "He's fair mostly, but he doesn't like complicated things in his courtroom, and this Aldridge seems to be making it complicated." "What does he want out of it?" Cole asked. He had been listening from the chair beside Evelyn, largely quiet. "If he takes it to an actual hearing, there are a few possibilities," Helena said. "He could be trying to establish enough legal noise to persuade Miss Carter to cooperate with whatever he actually wants. Intimidation, essentially, with a legal face on it. Or—" She picked up the letter again. "He's alleging damages. If he can claim she broke an agreement, he could claim he's owed something. Money, possibly, or cooperation in some other matter." "The land," Evelyn said. Helena looked at her. "He described property to me that I don't think exists the way he described it. Or maybe it doesn't exist at all." She leaned forward. "Is there a way to find out what he actually owns in this territory? Deed records, land office filings?" Helena's expression sharpened with interest. "That I can look into. The land office records for this circuit come through here." She stood. "Give me an hour." The hour was productive. Warren James Aldridge had filed a land claim 2 years ago. 400 acres northeast of Red Hollow, along a creek called Dry Fork. The filing looked legitimate on its face, but there was also, and Helena found this with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knew where things were buried, a competing claim on 40 of those same acres filed 6 months later by a man named Goss, and a notation that the original survey had been contested and the matter referred to the Territorial Land Office for review. There was also, filed 8 months ago, a lien on the Aldridge claim from a lending institution in Denver. "He borrowed against land that's in dispute," Cole said, looking at the document spread on Helena's desk. "And the lender would want repayment regardless of how the land dispute resolves," Helena said. "If the land claim is partially invalidated, or if he can't service the debt, he has a problem." Evelyn sat looking at the papers. She was thinking about the satisfied look. About the way he had returned to Red Hollow after walking away. About the letter referencing a binding agreement. "If we were married," she said slowly, "he would have a wife with a legal identity attached to his. Another name on documents. And if he'd successfully claimed I owed him damages, if he'd gotten some judgment or settlement out of me, that's money against the debt. Or leverage," Cole said. "Something to show the lender that the situation is being managed." Helena looked at both of them. "I can't say any of that is definitely what's happening, but it fits the shape of it." Evelyn looked at the lien document. The amount on it was not enormous, but it was not small. It was the kind of number that became serious when the collateral behind it was uncertain. "What do I do?" she asked. "3 things," Helena said, in the tone of a woman who had seen enough of these situations to have developed a procedure. "First, write a formal response to this letter. I'll help you draft it. Declining to attend any meeting and stating clearly that you consider no agreement to exist. This creates a paper record of your position. Second, document your actual arrival circumstances. The empty platform, any witnesses, the depot agent if he'll give a statement. Third," she paused, Find out if anyone else in Red Hollow or the surrounding area has had dealings with Aldridge that didn't go well. Men who operate this way rarely do it once. Cole was looking at Evelyn. She could feel it without turning. I'll start asking, he said, to Helena or to Evelyn or to both. They left Brixton in the late afternoon and drove back through the cooling air with the documents, copies Helena had made, careful and precise, in Evelyn's bag. The mountains turned colors at the edge of the day, the kind of extravagant reds and golds that the frontier did in the evenings, as if to compensate for how brutal it was the rest of the time. He planned this, Evelyn said after a while. The letters, the invitation, it wasn't impulsive. He was looking for something specific, a woman who'd come without family to back her, without connections in the territory. Cole's voice was flat in the way it got when he was managing anger. Someone who'd be isolated enough to be manageable. And then whatever the land situation is got complicated faster than he planned, and he panicked and left. She turned it over. And then he came back because the situation got worse. You being settled at the ranch probably didn't help his calculations, Cole said. No. She almost laughed, though it wasn't funny. He expected to find someone desperate and grateful, someone who'd go along with whatever he needed because there was no other option. Cole was quiet for a moment. Are you... He stopped. What? Are you worried about how this plays out? She considered the honest answer. Yes, she said. Not frightened, but yes. She looked at the road ahead. I've been the person with fewer resources than the person across from me for most of my life. I know what it feels like when the game is tilted. She paused. But I also know that tilted doesn't mean finished. Cole nodded once. He said nothing else, and she appreciated that he didn't try to tell her it would be fine, because he didn't know that, and they both knew he didn't. Back in Red Hollow, things were moving. She felt it the way you feel a shift in weather, not because anything specific had happened yet, but because the air had changed. People looked at her differently. Not unkindly, exactly, but with that particular attention that meant a story was forming around her and they were waiting to see how it turned out. Warren had been in the saloon. Warren had been at the church social, which she hadn't attended but heard about from Mrs. Fitch, who had attended and had observations. He was talking. Not making accusations, apparently, too careful for that, but shaping a narrative with the subtle skill of someone who had done it before. The narrative, as best she could piece it together from what Mrs. Fitch and the general store clerk and a woman named Bess from 2 streets over told her, was something like a misunderstanding, a complicated situation, a woman who had perhaps not understood the nature of what she'd agreed to. It was not a loud story. It was a quiet one. And quiet stories were harder to answer because they didn't give you anything direct to push back against. She wrote the formal response with Helena's draft as a guide, sitting at the kitchen table after Daniel was in bed and Cole was doing his accounts. She wrote it out 3 times until it was clean and precise, stating her position without emotion, documenting the empty platform, referencing the depot agent by name. Is that good? Daniel asked, appearing at her elbow. He had been in bed. He was demonstrably not in bed. You're supposed to be asleep, Evelyn said. I woke up. He looked at the paper. Are you writing a letter? Something like that. To who? Nobody interesting. He climbed into the chair beside her and looked at her writing with the authority of someone who had recently been learning to read and now applied this skill to all situations. That says decline, he said. It does. What are you declining? Something I don't want. He nodded as if this were perfectly satisfying. Then he put his head down on the table with the bonelessness of a very tired child and fell asleep there, which was perhaps the most decisive commentary available on the matter. Cole came in from the parlor, took in the scene, and picked Daniel up with the practiced ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times. He carried him upstairs without waking him. When he came back down, he looked at the letter on the table. Done? Almost. She added the final line. Her name, precise and clear. Done. He picked it up and read it. He read slowly, which she had noticed before, not because he was slow, but because he was thorough. When he set it down, he said, That's good. Helena's draft was good. I just made it mine. The part at the end is yours, he said. She wouldn't have put it that way. The part at the end read, I will not be managed by a situation I did not create and did not agree to. I am prepared to establish this before any court in this territory. She looked at it. Too much? No, Cole said. It's exactly enough. She folded the letter. She would have it delivered in the morning. Whatever happened after that would happen, and she would meet it. What happened after that was a hearing. Creighton filed, apparently at Aldridge's direction, a formal complaint with Judge Harlan's court. It was scheduled for 3 weeks from that Monday. The notice came in the same kind of formal-looking envelope as the first letter, but this one had a court seal on it, which made it actual. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and read it and felt the arithmetic of it. 3 weeks, no lawyer within 40 miles who wasn't already compromised by Aldridge's introductions. Her own documentation thin but present. She put the notice on the table and went to find Cole. He was splitting wood behind the barn, which was what he did when he was working through something. The woodpile was already substantial. We have a court date, she said. He set the axe down. She handed him the notice. He read it. 3 weeks, he said. Yes. I'll go back to Brixton, he said. Helena knows the law better than Creighton does. She can advise you on how to present. She can't appear in court. No, but you can. He looked at her with the steady attention that was, she had come to understand, his version of confidence in someone. You know this situation better than Aldridge does. You know what he actually did and what he's actually claiming, and you have the documents from the land office. He doesn't know we have those, she said. No. Something moved in Cole's expression. Not quite satisfaction, but something in that neighborhood. He doesn't. She looked at the wood pile, then at the notice, then at the mountains, which were doing nothing helpful but were present. I need to know about the depot agent, she said, whether he'll give a statement, and whether anyone else in the territory has had dealings with Aldridge that went wrong. I'll start asking, Cole said. I know people in 3 towns who know people in 5 more. We've got 3 weeks. She nodded once. She took the notice back and folded it and put it in her apron pocket alongside the weight she'd been carrying since Warren Aldridge's horse appeared outside the hotel. Why are you helping me? She asked. It was a question she'd been not asking for a while. Cole picked up the axe again. He looked at the next log for a moment. You didn't have to stay in this town, he said. After what happened on that platform, you could have gotten back on the train. You stayed. You built something here. He set the log. And the man who's coming after you, he picked this town too. That makes it partly mine. He swung the axe. The log split cleanly. Evelyn watched him for a moment. Then she went back to the house because there was dinner to make, and Daniel would be home from the schoolhouse soon, and the next 3 weeks would require her to be sharp and rested and at her most practical, and none of that happened on its own. She was still building. That was the thing Warren Aldridge had not accounted for. She had been building since the day she arrived, quietly and daily, and what she had built was not easily dismantled by a man who'd tried to make it look like a legal problem. She put water on to boil. She got out the flour. She began. The 3 weeks before the hearing were not quiet ones. Cole went back to Brixton twice, and each time he came back with something useful. A contact here, a piece of information there, the slow accumulation of detail that didn't look like much individually, but was starting to form a shape. Helena Aldis sent a written summary of the relevant territorial statutes regarding promise of marriage claims, annotated in the margins with her own assessments, which were frank and occasionally caustic, in ways that made Evelyn grateful for the woman's existence. Evelyn spent her evenings at the kitchen table after Daniel was in bed, building her case the way she built everything else. Methodically, with no assumption that anything would simply work out. She had the depot agent's written statement, which the man had given with evident relief, apparently having felt guilty about the situation for 2 months. She had the land office documents from Helena, the competing claim, the lien, the contested survey. She had her letters from Warren, which she had kept because she kept everything, a habit formed in childhood when she'd learned that paper had a way of mattering later. What she didn't have was a lawyer. She'd written to the county seat after the hearing notice arrived. The response came back apologetic and useless. The only practicing attorney in the county was already retained by a client in an ongoing land dispute and had a conflict of interest in any matter touching Warren Aldridge. She did not understand immediately why that was, and then she did, and that understanding settled in her chest like cold water. Aldridge had retained the only lawyer available. Whether by design or by luck, the effect was the same. "He's done this before," she told Cole, the evening she worked it out. They were on the porch, which had become their habit. Not every evening, but most, this half hour between Daniel's bedtime and the hour they each went their separate ways. "Or someone told him to do it," Cole said. "Either way." She looked at her hands. "I'm going to have to speak for myself." Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, something moved in the dark at the field's edge. A deer, probably, or the wind in the cottonwoods. "Is that a problem?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I've never spoken in a courtroom," she said. "I don't know the procedures. I'll make mistakes." "Creighton's not much better." "No, but Creighton has the form of a lawyer, and Judge Harlan will be more comfortable with familiar forms." She looked at the dark field. "I need to be better prepared than Creighton, not just as good, which means knowing the law well enough to catch him when he's wrong and precise enough in my own argument that the judge can't dismiss it on technical grounds." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "Helena," he said, "I know. I'm going back to Brixton." "I'll take you." "You don't have to." "The ranch can manage 2 days," he said, in the tone that closed a subject. She let it close. Done. Helena spent 3 hours with her in the Brixton office, going through procedure and precedent, and the specific weaknesses of Creighton's complaint. She was a rigorous teacher, not unkind, but without patience for vagueness, which suited Evelyn perfectly. "The complaint alleges breach of a promise of marriage," Helena said. "For that to hold, there must be a clear and mutual agreement. Both parties must have understood themselves to be promised. Your correspondence will be examined. What did his letters actually say?" "He said he was looking for a wife. He described his land and his life. He invited me to come and said we would discuss the future when I arrived." "Did he use the word engaged or promised or any equivalent?" "No." "Did you?" "No." Helena made a note. "Good. Ambiguous language works against him. He'll try to have the letters read as implicit agreement. You'll argue they were expressions of intent to discuss, not commitment. The distinction matters." She looked up. "What's his best argument?" "That I came. That the act of traveling here constitutes acceptance." "Yes. And your counter?" "That I came to meet and consider, not to comply. That the decision to marry remains with the individual regardless of prior correspondence, and that his failure to be present when I arrived effectively terminated any informal understanding that might have existed." Helena nodded. "Correct. There's a ruling from the circuit court 4 years ago, Halverson versus Merritt, where the court held that an agreement to correspond does not constitute an agreement to marry. I'll write it out for you. I also have these." Evelyn spread the land office documents on the desk. Helena looked at them and then at Evelyn with an expression that was as close to approval as the woman seemed to get. "Where did you find the lien filing?" "You found it, the first time we came." "I'd forgotten I kept a copy." She looked at the documents more carefully. "He's going to argue this is irrelevant to the matter before the court." "Is it?" "Technically, yes. But it speaks to his character and his motives for pursuing this claim, and if you can get it into evidence as context." She paused, thinking. "Harlan has some latitude in what he allows in his courtroom. He's not a formal judge by training. He'll either allow it as background or he won't, but it's worth trying." "How do I get it in?" "You ask him, directly. You explain that you believe the claim was filed not in pursuit of justice, but in pursuit of financial advantage, and you offer the documents as evidence of that motive." Helena looked at her. "He may shut it down. If he does, don't push. Note your objection and move on." "And if he allows it?" "Then you've changed the question the court is asking. It's no longer about whether an agreement existed. It's about why this particular man is pursuing this particular claim and what he stands to gain." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. "He's going to try to embarrass me," she said, "in the courtroom. Make the case about my character instead of his." "Yes," Helena said without softening it. "He will. Men in his position usually do. The argument will be something like, 'You came west to marry, you're now living on a man's ranch. What does that tell us about the nature of your arrangements?'" She met Evelyn's eyes. You need to be ready for that, and you need to answer it without getting angry, because anger will read as guilt to a room full of people who want a simple story. What do I say? The truth. You work for Cole Mercer. You keep house and manage the property in exchange for wages. There's nothing ambiguous about it. State it like it's obvious, because it is, and the attempt to make it otherwise is the only thing that makes it seem complicated. Evelyn nodded. She wrote it down. She wrote down everything in the small, neat hand she had developed over years of keeping the dress shop's books when the owner trusted her enough to let her. On the way back, Cole drove and she went over her notes, and he let her, without attempting conversation, which was exactly right. The sky was enormous above the road, the way it got in the late afternoon on the open land. She read and made additional notes and read again until she knew the shape of what she was going to do. The last week before the hearing brought its own pressures. Bess, the woman from 2 streets over who had appointed herself something like Evelyn's informal network in town, reported that Aldridge had been spending evenings at the saloon buying drinks for anyone who'd take one. He was telling his story with more confidence now. The aggrieved man, the broken promise, the woman who had taken advantage of his good faith and then installed herself on another man's property. He was not loud about it. He was quiet and injured and reasonable, and that tone was more effective than loud would have been. The town was dividing, as small towns always did. Not sharply, not dramatically, but in the way water finds the lowest channel. People who had liked her for 2 months found themselves uncertain. People who hadn't known her at all were filling that uncertainty with the story Aldridge was providing. Mrs. Fitch, who had never fully committed to any opinion, was maintaining what she called neutrality and what Evelyn recognized as self-preservation. A few people, though, held differently. The depot agent had given his statement without hesitation. A rancher named Hobart, who farmed 15 miles southeast of Red Hollow, came into town specifically to tell Cole that he had a neighbor who'd had a land deal go bad with Aldridge 3 years ago in another county. A man named Tesler, who had signed a working agreement with Aldridge on a piece of land that turned out to have a prior claim nobody had disclosed. Tesler had lost 2 years of work and most of his savings. "Will he say so in court?" Evelyn asked when Cole relayed this. "Hobart thinks so. Tesler's got no love for Aldridge and nothing to lose. He's 4 counties away from that experience. Why would Aldridge think he could come here and do the same thing without anyone knowing?" "Because most of the time people don't talk to each other across 4 counties, Cole said. He's used to it working. She wrote to Tesler herself, a careful letter explaining the situation and what his testimony might mean. She did not beg. She explained and asked, which was all she knew how to do. The letter came back 4 days before the hearing. Tesler would come. He'd ride 2 days to do it, and his reasons were his own, but he would come. Evelyn sat with that letter for a long time before she put it in the file with the others. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cool, the kind of fall morning that smelled like something ending. Daniel knew something was happening. He had the animal awareness of children around adult tension, and he had been watching Evelyn all week with a careful attention that was almost more than she could bear. That morning at breakfast, he didn't chatter, which was so unusual it was its own kind of loud. When she was putting on her coat, the good one, the navy wool she'd been saving for occasions, he appeared at her elbow. "Are you going to win?" he asked. She looked at him. He was 6 years old, standing in his socks on the kitchen floor, with a piece of toast still in his hand. "I'm going to do my best," she said, which was the honest answer. He considered this. "Pa says your best is usually pretty good." She glanced at Cole, who was pulling on his hat with the absorbed attention of someone who had not just said anything. "Finish your breakfast," she told Daniel. She bent and kissed the top of his head, which was something she did not examine too closely. He let her, which was something he did not examine either. Mrs. Holloway was coming again to stay with him. Evelyn had left a list, his lunch, his afternoon, the things he liked and didn't like, and Mrs. Holloway had taken it with the good-natured efficiency of a woman who had raised 4 children and found other people's instructions about child management mostly unnecessary, but was too polite to say so. Cole drove them into town. Judge Harlan's courtroom occupied the 2nd floor of the only 2-story building on Main Street that wasn't the hotel. It was smaller than Evelyn had imagined, perhaps 40 chairs set in rows, a raised platform at the front with the judge's desk, 2 tables facing it. The room smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of a space used for serious things. It was already more than half full. She had not expected the town to come out, or not this many of them. But there they were, ranchers and shopkeepers and women she recognized from the market and men she had seen on the street. Some of them she knew well enough by now to read their expressions. Others were simply present, attentive, watching the door when she walked in. Warren Aldridge was already at the plaintiff's table, Creighton beside him. Aldridge was dressed well, as always. He looked like what he was presenting himself as, which was a reasonable, wronged man of means. When he saw her walk in, he nodded, as if conceding a small point before the larger contest had begun. She did not nod back. She went to the other table and set down her folder. The letters, the depot agent's statement, the land office documents, Tesler's written account, and she sat down and looked straight ahead. Cole took a seat in the front row of the gallery. She did not look at him. She was not going to need to look at him, she had decided. She knew he was there, which was enough. Harlan entered and the room settled. He was a big man, older, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being impressed by the theater of it. "We're here on a complaint filed by Warren Aldridge against Evelyn Carter," he said. "Mr. Creighton is presenting for the plaintiff. Miss Carter is representing herself, which I understand from her written responses by choice and not by lack of resource." He looked at her over his glasses. "Is that accurate, Miss Carter?" "It is, Your Honor," she said. Her voice came out clear, which she was grateful for. "All right. Mr. Creighton, present your complaint." Creighton was not a bad lawyer, she had come to understand. He was a mediocre one, which was different. He had competence without excellence, which meant he could follow a path but couldn't improvise well when the path changed. He presented Aldridge's version of events in reasonable order. The correspondence, the invitation, the understanding that Miss Carter was coming west with the intention of marriage, the expenses Aldridge had incurred in preparation, the damages from the broken agreement. He was careful about what he said and what he didn't say. He did not claim a written contract. He claimed a clear mutual understanding evidenced by the course of correspondence and the deliberate act of cross-country travel. When he was done, Harlan looked at Evelyn. "Miss Carter." She stood. She had written out what she intended to say, and then she had not looked at those notes for 2 days, because the words needed to be hers in the moment, not a recitation. "Your Honor," she said, "I want to address 3 things: what was agreed, what actually happened, and why this claim was filed." She laid her folder on the table and kept her hands flat on either side of it. "Mr. Aldridge and I exchanged letters for 4 months. In those letters, he described a property and a life and invited me to come and see it. I replied. I asked questions. He answered them, or gave answers that appeared to answer them. At no point in our correspondence did either of us use the language of promise or engagement. At no point did we sign any document. At no point did anyone witness or affirm any agreement between us." She paused. Harlan was looking at her steadily. "I came west because I believed the life he described was real," she said. "When I arrived at this station, the platform was empty. There was no Mr. Aldridge. There was no message, no letter, no arrangement made for my reception. The depot agent, whose signed statement is in my folder, can confirm that." She picked up the statement and laid it on the edge of the table. Mr. Aldridge was not present because he had left town the previous day. He made that choice. Whatever understanding he now claims existed between us, he chose not to honor it himself. Creighton shifted in his seat. Aldridge was very still. "I would ask the court to consider," Evelyn continued, "what damages Mr. Aldridge can reasonably claim from a woman who arrived where he told her to arrive, on the day he told her to arrive, and found him gone." She let that sit for a moment. "He left. I stayed. I found honest work and I have done it. The claim before this court has the shape of a legal proceeding, but it is not one, because there is no breach on my part of any agreement that ever existed." Harlan leaned forward slightly. "You said you wanted to address 3 things, Miss Carter. You've addressed 2. "Yes, Your Honor." She looked directly at him. "I believe this claim was filed not because Mr. Aldridge is aggrieved, but because he needs something from this proceeding that has nothing to do with me." She reached for the land office documents. "I'd like to submit these as evidence of context." Creighton was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Those documents bear no relevance to the matter. Let me see them, Harlan said. Creighton sat down, not happily. Harlan took the documents and read them with the thoroughness he applied to everything. He read for a long time. The room was very quiet. Where did you obtain these, Miss Carter? He asked, without looking up. The land office records for this circuit are available at the Brixton Courthouse Annex. These are certified copies. He looked up at that. He looked at her, and then at Aldridge, and then back at the documents. Mr. Creighton, he said. Your Honor, is your client aware of the contents of these documents? Creighton glanced at Aldridge. I'm not certain what documents. His land claim has a competing filing and an active lien, Harlan said, in the tone of a man who had now been given the full picture and was rearranging his understanding accordingly. A lien from a Denver lending institution. He set the documents down. Miss Carter, explain to me the relevance you believe these have. A man with a debt against disputed land needs resources, she said simply. A legal judgment in his favor, even a small one, represents something he could take to his lender to demonstrate that the situation is being managed. Or he might have hoped that the threat of legal proceedings would persuade me to agree to an arrangement that would provide him a cooperative partner in whatever he needs to do with that land. She kept her voice level. I'm not alleging I know exactly which it is. I'm saying the question of why this claim exists is at least as important as the question of whether it has merit. Wool? Nashetting. The room behind her had the particular silence of people who have stopped moving. Aldridge said, from the plaintiff's table, this is... And then Harlan looked at him with a single look, and he stopped. You'll have your turn, Mr. Aldridge, Harlan said. But the moment had turned. She could feel it in the room the way you feel a temperature change. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. The story Warren had been constructing for 3 weeks had been, in those minutes, given a different context, and context was the thing that changed how every piece of evidence looked. Harlan called Tesler next. She had listed him as a witness in her written response, and the judge, to his credit, had read the whole response carefully enough to know he'd be present. Tesler was a raw-boned man in his 50s with the look of someone who had lost something and made his peace with it but hadn't forgotten. He sat in the witness chair and spoke plainly, without elaboration. He had entered a working agreement with Warren Aldridge on a piece of land in another county 3 years ago. The land had a prior claim that Aldridge had not disclosed. He had lost 2 years of work and his investment when the prior claim was upheld. He had no documentation with him. He'd sent what he had ahead, and it was in Evelyn's folder. Creighton cross-examined without real conviction. The prior county, different circumstances, not relevant to the present matter. It was technically defensible and practically useless. The room had already heard it. Then Aldridge himself spoke. He was good. She had to grant him that. He was controlled and measured, and he told his version with the practiced fluency of someone who had rehearsed it long enough to almost believe it himself. The understanding between them had been clear, he said. Her journey west was confirmation of that understanding. Her subsequent actions, taking up residence on another man's property, had caused him both personal and financial damage. He was convincing right up until Evelyn stood to respond. Mr. Aldridge, she said, and looked directly at him across the space of the courtroom. In your letters, did you ever use the word engagement? He held her gaze. The implication was clear. The word, she said. Did you use it? A pause. Not specifically. Did I? Your coming here was... Did I use the word engagement or promise or betrothed or any equivalent in any letter I wrote to you? Another pause. You expressed yes or no, Mr. Aldridge. The room was very still. No, he said. Thank you. She looked at Harlan. The letters are in my folder. Every one of them. I offer them for the court's examination. Harlan held out his hand for the folder. She sat down. Her heart was moving fast, and her hands were less steady than she'd have liked, but she kept them flat on the table, and she did not show it. Harlan did not rule that day. He took the documents and announced he would issue a ruling the following week. The courtroom began emptying with the buzzing, particular energy of people who had witnessed something and needed to discuss it immediately. Evelyn sat at her table for a moment longer than necessary, letting the room thin, letting her pulse settle. Aldridge left without looking at her. Creighton gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. The gallery filed out in twos and threes. Cole was waiting when she finally stood. He was at the edge of the gallery railing, hat in hand, and he did not say anything, just looked at her with that steady receiving look. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I don't think I made it worse." "You didn't make it worse," he said. They walked out together into the October air, which had sharpened since morning. The sky, the particular blue that came right before the cold, settled in for good. Around them, Red Hollow was going about its afternoon. The horses at the rail, the sound of the general store, two women on the far sidewalk who looked in her direction and then away, or didn't look away. She couldn't be sure. "Tesler," she said. "I need to thank him before he rides back." "He's at the livery." She nodded. She walked to the livery and found Tesler checking his horse's bridle, and she thanked him plainly, and he received it the same way without ceremony. "Aldridge needs to hear that his way of doing things has consequences," Tesler said. "That's all." He checked the cinch on his saddle. "You did all right in there, for someone without a lawyer." "I had good preparation," she said. "Preparation's most of it." He mounted up. "Hope the judge sees straight." She hoped so too. She watched him ride out and then turn back to the street, to Cole waiting with the wagon, to the drive back to the ranch and Daniel's questions, and the evening that would be ordinary and necessary and exactly what she needed. She did not know what Harlan would decide. She had done everything she could do, said everything she knew how to say, and now the outcome was in the hands of a man she couldn't control, in a room she'd have to wait outside of. That was the hardest part. Not the speaking, the waiting. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Cole handed her the reins briefly while he untied, then took them back. They pulled out onto Main Street, and she looked at the building where the courtroom was, the ordinary two-story structure with its ordinary windows, holding whatever the judge was thinking. Then it was behind them, and ahead was the road home, and the sky doing its colors again above the mountains, and she turned forward and let it be what it was. Not resolved, not finished, not safe yet, but not lost either. 1 week at a time. She still knew how to do that. The week between the hearing and the ruling was the longest Evelyn could remember, since the days immediately after her mother died, when time had moved in that particular thick, resistant way grief produces. She worked. That was what she did with waiting. She filled the space of it with something her hands could manage. She finished caulking the window frames on the north side of the house before the real cold arrived. She reorganized the root cellar, which had been stocked with the practical urgency of a man who put things in without a system and retrieved them by memory. She made preserves from the last of the kitchen garden's yield, standing over the stove for 2 full afternoons while the jars lined up on the counter and steam gathered on the windows. Daniel helped in his way. He stood on a chair and stirred things when asked and tasted things without being asked and provided ongoing opinions about everything. His presence was, she had come to understand, not a distraction from thinking, but a different kind of thinking. The kind that happened at a lower register while the surface of your attention was occupied elsewhere. On the 3rd evening after the hearing, he said during dinner, "Thomas at school says you're going to have to leave." Cole set his fork down with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling a reaction. Evelyn looked at Daniel. He was watching her with the direct, undefended gaze of a child who has reported a thing without yet understanding all its dimensions. "Thomas says a lot of things," she said. "He said his mother said it." Daniel looked at his plate. "I told him he was wrong." "On what grounds?" Evelyn asked. He looked up. "What? What reason did you give him for being wrong?" He thought about it. "I said you don't have to go anywhere because you're here," he said, with the absolute logical confidence of a 6-year-old. "And here's where you live." Evelyn looked at her plate for a moment. "That's a good argument," she said. Cole picked his fork back up. He didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer to everything. Aldridge was still in town. She knew this because Bess reported it, and because on the 4th day she saw his horse outside the hotel when she came in for supplies. She did not see him directly, which she was relieved by, though she was also honest enough with herself to recognize that the relief was partly about not having to manage her own response to him in public. She had done what she could in that courtroom. She had said what was true and documented what was real and asked the questions that needed asking. But the outcome was Harlan's, and Harlan was a man she had met once, in a formal setting, with no means of knowing what he thought beyond what his expression suggested, which was mostly concentrated attention and very little else. On the fifth day, Cole came in from the barn with an expression she'd learned to read as news he was sorting before delivering. "Harlan's made his decision," he said. "The notice went up this morning. Ruling issued tomorrow at 10. She was at the kitchen table with a mending basket. She set it down. "Did anyone say anything about—" "No, just the time and the date." He looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes." She considered. "Mostly." He sat down across from her, which was unusual for the middle of the day. He had the posture of a man who had decided to say something and was working out the approach. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "you did everything right. The preparation, the hearing, everything." "That's kind of you." "It's not kindness, it's an observation." He looked at her directly. "If Harlan rules wrong, it's not because you failed. It's because the system he operates in has limits." "I know," she said. "I've known systems with limits my whole life." She looked at the mending basket, the ordinary pile of socks, and a shirt of Daniel's with a torn seam. "But knowing that doesn't fully cushion it if it goes the wrong way." "No," Cole agreed. "It doesn't." They sat at the table in the quiet kitchen for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it in the cottonwoods, that particular sound that meant the season had finally committed to itself. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said, which was the most expansive thing she had heard him say. She looked at him. "If I lose tomorrow, if he rules against me and there's some judgment or some order I don't know how to fight, what do I do?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of avoiding the question, but the quiet of a man who was treating it with the weight it deserved. "We appeal to the circuit court," he said. "Helena can help with that. And if Aldridge tries to claim anything through a judgment, we get ahead of it with the land office records, take them to the territorial commissioner if we have to. He's been operating in multiple counties with the same pattern. That's not a local matter anymore." He paused. "And you stay. Whatever paper says, you work here, and that's real, and paper doesn't change what's real on the ground." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without discomfort. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me for things," he said, not unkindly. She picked up the mending basket. He went back outside. The wind moved in the cottonwoods, and the afternoon settled back into itself, ordinary and necessary the way afternoons did. She slept badly, which she had expected. She lay in the narrow bed in the room that had been a housekeeper's room and was now hers in the way things become yours, through use and time, and she listened to the ranch settle around her in the dark. She was not afraid of Aldridge exactly. She had passed through fear of him somewhere in the middle weeks, and come out the other side into something more like clear assessment. He was a man who used legal and social pressure as tools, who selected targets who appeared isolated, who relied on the difficulty of resistance to accomplish what direct confrontation couldn't. The courtroom had shifted some of that, but she knew that a ruling in his favor, even a partial one, even a technical one, would restore his footing and change the calculation. What kept her awake was not fear, but the unresolved quality of it. The not yet. She was a person who could manage bad outcomes. She had done it before, multiple times, at significant cost. What she had never learned to manage gracefully was the gap between the action and its consequence. She was still awake when she heard Daniel. He was not crying, exactly. It was a different sound, the particular sound of a child having a nightmare and not quite waking from it. She had learned to recognize it over the months. It happened perhaps once a week, more when he was unsettled. She got up. His room was down the hall, small, with a window that faced east. She sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his back, the way she had learned worked better than voice, and after a moment the sound stopped and his breathing evened out. She sat there in the dark for a while, listening to him sleep. The house was quiet, except for the wind and the small sounds of wood and settling. She heard Cole's door down the hall. A pause. Then he appeared in the doorway. She could see his shape in the dark, backlit faintly by the window at the end of the passage. "He okay?" Cole asked, very quietly. "Fine," she said, equally quiet. "Nightmare." He stayed in the doorway for a moment. She stayed on the edge of Daniel's bed. The child slept on, unaware of either of them. "Does he do this often?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "More than I'd like." Cole leaned against the doorframe. Less than he used to, after Sarah. He paused. He used to wake up every night for almost 6 months, calling for her. She looked at Daniel, at his face, peaceful now, the way sleeping children's faces always looked like earlier, simpler versions of themselves. "What did you do?" she asked. Sat with him. Cole's voice was quiet, without self-pity. "Same as you're doing." She looked up at him in the doorway. He was looking at his son with the expression she had never found a full name for. The particular look of a parent confronting how much they cannot protect a child from. "Go to sleep," she said gently. "I'll sit with him a bit." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back down the hall, and she heard his door close softly, and she sat in the dark with Daniel and listened to the wind outside and let the night take as long as it needed. The courtroom the next morning was fuller than it had been for the hearing. She had not expected that. She walked in with Cole and stopped for a moment at the door, taken by the number of people already seated. The hardware man. 2 ranching families she recognized from the market. Bess, in the 3rd row, who caught Evelyn's eye and gave a small, decisive nod. The depot agent, who looked at her with the expression of a man who had done what he could and hoped it had mattered. Hobart was there, the rancher who had connected them with Tesler. He was sitting in the back with his hat in his hands. He nodded when Cole came in. It was not a crowd gathered for spectacle, she understood. Or not only that, some of them had made a decision about which side of this they stood on, and they were here to stand on it. That understanding did something in her chest she did not entirely have words for. She sat down at her table and opened her folder and put her hands flat and looked forward. Aldridge was already at his table, Creighton beside him. Whatever Aldridge had expected the room to look like this morning, she was fairly certain it was not this. Harlan entered. The room stood, then settled. "I've reviewed the testimony and documentation from Monday's hearing," Harlan said, without preamble. He was a man who did not perform. "I want to say first that this court takes seriously any proceeding brought before it, regardless of the complexity of the underlying claim. With that said, I have a ruling." He opened the document in front of him and read, "In the matter of Aldridge versus Carter, the court finds as follows. The correspondence between the plaintiff and the defendant does not constitute a binding agreement of marriage under territorial law. The court finds no mutual, explicit promise of marriage in the letters submitted as evidence. The act of travel to meet a prospective partner does not, in itself, represent acceptance of an agreement not yet formed." Creighton's pen had stopped moving. "Furthermore," Harlan continued, "the court finds that the plaintiff's absence from the agreed meeting point on the date of the defendant's arrival represents a material failure of good faith on the plaintiff's part, which undermines any claim of breach by the defendant." Aldridge had gone very still. The court also notes, and while these matters are not strictly before this court, they bear on the question of good faith, that the plaintiff holds a land claim in this territory which carries an active financial lien and a competing filing that has not been resolved. The court notes this context without ruling on it and refers the matter to the Territorial Land Commissioner for appropriate review. The room behind her was very quiet. "The complaint is dismissed," Harlan said. "The defendant is found to have committed no breach of any agreement. Court costs are assessed to the plaintiff." He closed the document. The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of room, or not quite, but it exhaled collectively the way a room does when something that has been held tightly is released. Evelyn sat absolutely still for a moment. She heard Cole behind her, but not a sound exactly, but a presence, a shift. She heard Bess say something to the woman beside her. She heard Creighton begin speaking in a low, urgent voice to Aldridge, and she heard Aldridge's response, which was short and had an edge in it. Then Harlan said, "We're adjourned," and the room began to move. She picked up her folder. She stood. Her legs were entirely steady, which surprised her, given that her heart was doing something complicated and loud. She turned around. Cole was right there, a step behind the railing. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything immediately, which was exactly right. "It's done," she said finally. "It's done," he agreed. But it wasn't done, entirely. She understood this when she turned and saw Aldridge moving toward the side exit, not fleeing exactly, but moving with the contained urgency of a man recalculating while in motion. Creighton was beside him, talking. Aldridge was not listening, or not listening to Creighton. He was looking at her. He stopped. It was not a decision she could predict or prevent. He stopped and looked at her across the emptying courtroom, and his expression was not the one she expected. Not anger, not the injured dignity she'd seen in his better performances. It was something colder and more fundamental. The look of a man who has miscalculated and knows it and is, in this moment, deciding what that means. Cole moved slightly to her left, just a small shift of weight, and she was aware of it without looking at him. "You've made this more complicated than it needed to be," Aldridge said. He said it quietly, like a statement of fact rather than a threat. "You made it complicated," she said. "I just showed up to the conversation you started. The land matter—" He stopped. "That was unnecessary." "You involved a court," she said. "Courts look at context." The context was relevant. His jaw moved. He was a man who had always operated in spaces where he controlled the available information, and the experience of finding that information in someone else's hands was clearly unfamiliar. "What do you want?" he said. Not hostile, almost genuine, like he had dropped one layer of performance and was trying to understand the actual architecture beneath. "I wanted to work and live without being harassed by a legal proceeding I didn't earn," she said. "I have that now. I don't want anything else from you." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Cole, briefly, with an expression she couldn't fully read, some mixture of assessment and recognition, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding what he'd walked into and how wrong his original calculations had been. Then he turned and went through the side door, and Creighton followed, and the courtroom was nearly empty. The afternoon had that particular quality of days after a long effort, slightly unreal, the air thinned of its previous urgency. She and Cole walked out into the October street, and people stopped to speak to them, briefly, in the way of a frontier town after a public event. Hobart shook Cole's hand. Bess gripped Evelyn's arm and said, "Good," with the succinctness of someone who had said everything else already in their thoughts. The depot agent found her and said he was glad the statement had been useful, and she thanked him and meant it. There were others, too. A woman she'd spoken to perhaps twice at the market who simply said, "Well done," and moved on. A man she didn't recognize at all who tipped his hat with something that looked like respect, and not much else. It was not a celebration. It was something quieter than that, a recalibration. The town had been watching a story form, and now it was watching a different conclusion than the one Aldridge had been constructing, and people were deciding what they thought about it. She was willing to give them time to decide. She didn't need the town's good opinion as urgently as she had needed the judge's ruling, and now that she had the ruling, she found she could afford patience with the rest of it. They went to the general store for supplies. She had come prepared to do errands regardless of outcome, because practical needs did not pause for dramatic ones. Petty was behind the counter with a different quality of attention than she usually received from him. He was not effusive about it, but he was present in a way he hadn't been before, asking about the ranch, about winter preparation, the kind of questions that indicated a person had been moved from one category to another in his mental filing. On the way out, flour and salt and coffee and a few other things in the back of the wagon, she said, "He's going to leave town." Cole was untying the horses. "Aldridge? He has no reason to stay. The ruling refers his land situation to the commissioner. Staying in Red Hollow only makes that more visible. So he goes somewhere else. Probably." She thought about Tesler, 2 days' ride away. She thought about the other counties, the other names that might be on similar correspondence, similar advertisements, similar letters that described a life that didn't exist. "I hope the territorial commissioner does something with the referral." "Helena will make sure they know it's there," Cole said. "She has more reach into that office than she lets on." Evelyn almost smiled. "I thought she might." Cole climbed up onto the wagon seat. She climbed up beside him. He took the reins and they pulled out onto Main Street, and she looked at the hotel, once, briefly, and then looked ahead at the road out of town. "What do you want to do?" Cole asked, after a while. She thought about the question. It was a bigger question than it sounded, given the last 3 weeks. "Go home," she said. He didn't respond to that immediately, and she was aware, suddenly, of what she'd said and how she'd said it. Not back to the ranch. Not back. Just home. As if the word had been there all along waiting for her to use it. Cole kept his eyes on the road. The horses moved at their usual pace. The mountains ahead sat in their long blue line, solid and entirely unmoved by everything that had happened in the courtroom that morning. "All right," he said. They drove in quiet for a while. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things settling, finding their level the way water does after it's been disturbed. "Daniel's going to ask 100 questions," Cole said, after a few miles. "Yes. And then he's going to want to celebrate in some way that involves the kitchen." "Almost certainly," she agreed. "His celebrations tend to be poorly planned and require a lot of cleanup." She looked at the road ahead and she let herself feel, just briefly, the full weight of what had shifted that morning. The ruling, the room full of people who had come to stand somewhere, Harlan's voice saying dismissed, the look on Aldridge's face that was the closest thing to an honest expression she'd ever seen from him. And then the drive home, ordinary and right, with the horses and the mountains and Cole beside her, saying nothing particularly remarkable about nothing particularly remarkable. "I'll make something good for dinner," she said. "He can help." "He'll insist on helping." "I know." She settled her hands in her lap. "Let him." The road ran on ahead of them, long and clear in the afternoon light. She watched it the way she had watched roads her whole life, for what was coming, for what the next distance held. But the quality of the watching was different now. It was not the watching of a woman looking for an exit or an option or a place to land if the current place dissolved. It was the watching of someone who had somewhere to come back to. That was new. That was, in its quiet way, the most significant thing that had happened in a day full of significant things. She did not say any of that. She didn't need to. She was going home, and that was enough for now, and the road between here and there was just a road ordinary and necessary, and hers. Warren Aldridge left Red Hollow 4 days after the ruling. Nobody saw him go, exactly. That was the kind of departure he made, without announcement or ceremony. The horse gone from the hotel stable one morning, and the room vacated before Mrs. Halverson, who ran the hotel, had come up to change the linens. He left a note that settled his bill, which she reported with some surprise, as if she had not entirely expected that. He simply ceased to be present. The space he had occupied in the town's attention, and he had occupied a considerable amount of it, for a man who had only been there a matter of weeks, closed over like water after a stone. People went back to talking about other things. The price of cattle, the early winter, a dispute about a fence line between 2 ranches east of town that had been simmering since summer. Evelyn learned of his departure from Bess, who learned it from Mrs. Halverson, which was the standard circuit for information in Red Hollow, and was, she had come to understand, actually fairly efficient. She was in the kitchen garden when Bess came out to tell her. The garden was mostly done for the season. She'd pulled what could be pulled and turned the soil on the beds she planned to replant in spring, working on the assumption, deliberate and chosen, that she would be here in spring to plant them. She was wearing her working clothes and had dirt on her hands, and she listened to what Bess said and then looked at the turned soil for a moment. "All right," she said. "That's it?" Bess looked at her with the mild frustration of someone who had walked 15 minutes to deliver news and expected a larger reaction. "What else should there be?" "I don't know. Relief, at least." "I have that," Evelyn said. "It's just quiet relief." Bess considered this. He went toward the county seat, from what the liveryman said, probably heading for Denver eventually. The land commissioner's office sent a man out to look at the Dry Fork claim 2 days ago. "I know." Helena wrote. Bess nodded. She looked at the garden, at the orderly turned beds, at the stakes Evelyn had left in for the spring planting. "You're planning to stay," she said. Not a question. "I'm planning to plant things," Evelyn said. "Same idea." Bess smiled at that, which was one of those complete smiles that transformed a face entirely. "Good," she said simply, and turned and walked back toward the road. Daniel's celebration dinner, true to Cole's prediction, was ambitious in concept and chaotic in execution. He had decided on the evening of the ruling that the occasion required a pie. Not a small pie, a large and serious pie, the kind that communicated the weight of the event. He had communicated this intention with the authority of someone who had given the matter considerable thought and was not open to alternatives. Evelyn had let him lead. That was, she had learned, the right approach to Daniel's kitchen ambitions. Establish the parameters that prevented genuine disaster and then let him make the decisions within them, including the wrong ones, which he would learn from in ways that correct ones didn't teach. The pie was apple, 'cause apples were what they had. He peeled them with the careful intensity of a child performing a grown-up task, dropping several, eating one, asking twice whether he was doing it right, and not waiting for the full answer before continuing. The crust was, technically, a crust. It had some rough patches, and one section that was notably thicker than the others, and the crimping around the edge bore the signature of small fingers that had pressed with enthusiasm rather than precision. It baked for longer than it should have because nobody remembered to check it at the right time. The bottom was darker than ideal, and the top was the specific shade of golden that was approximately one more minute from being a different problem. It was nevertheless eaten entirely. Cole had 3 pieces, which she suspected was not entirely about the pie, and Daniel monitored every bite taken by both of them with the vigilance of a craftsman watching his work be received. "It's good," Cole said, which was the truth, partial in the ways all truths about pies are partial. "The bottom's a bit burned," Daniel said with the dispassionate quality of an artist who has achieved some distance on his own work. "The bottom's fine," Cole said. "Evelyn didn't eat all of hers." She looked at her plate. She had eaten most of it. "I'm full," she said. "From 3 pieces?" "I had 2. He looked at her with the severity of a child counting. "You had 2 and a bit." "The bit was very good," she said, which was entirely true and satisfied him. Later, when Daniel was in bed, settled more quickly than usual, the week's tension having caught up with him in the way it caught up with children, all at once and without warning, she and Cole sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the pie between them and the lamp doing its usual work. "The commissioner's man came out to look at the dry fork claim," she said. "I heard." Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Hobart told me. He saw the man out on the northeast road. If they find what Helena's documents suggest, they will," Cole said. "Or enough of it." He looked at the table. Aldridge filed a claim on land that didn't quite belong to him the way he said it did, and borrowed money against it. "That doesn't go away because he moved counties." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She thought about Tesler, 2 days' ride away, who had come to say what he knew because a man's way of operating needed to have consequences. She thought about Helena in her small organized office in Brixton, who had found a lien filing and understood immediately what it meant. She thought about the depot agent, who had written out his statement with evident relief. "He chose the wrong town," she said. Cole looked at her with a slight expression that was the most his face usually did in the direction of amusement. He thought he was choosing the right one. Small, remote, no circuit lawyer. He paused. He didn't account for the people. "No," she said. He thought being alone was the same as being without resources. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you thought? When you first got here?" She looked at the lamp. "I thought I was managing a situation with the tools available. I didn't know yet what the tools were." She looked at him. "That took a while to find out." He nodded. He was quiet again, but it was the productive quiet she had long since learned to read. The quiet of a man who had something to say, and was making sure it was the right thing before saying it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." He looked at the table, then at her, with the directness he always had when he'd decided to do something uncomfortable. "This arrangement, the work, the wages, I need to know if it's what you want. Still, not as something you fell into because there was nothing else, but as something you'd choose." She looked at him. He was holding his coffee cup and looking at her with that open, careful attention, the same look he turned on the ranch ledgers when he was making sure he had the numbers right. "It stopped being something I fell into a while ago," she said. "I know. I'm asking what it is now." She thought about the kitchen garden and the spring planting. She thought about Daniel's pie and the lopsided biscuits from the first week, and the way he had said, "Here is where you live with such absolute certainty." She thought about the porch in the evenings, and the wagon ride to Brixton, and the conversation about Sarah that Cole had offered her like something he'd been deciding whether to trust her with. "It's home," she said, the same word she'd used in the wagon the day of the ruling. She let it stand. Cole was very still for a moment. The lamp threw its small, warm circle. Outside, the wind had died down, and the night was the particular quiet of a place that had settled into itself. "I'd like for it to be," he said. "Formally, if that's something you'd consider." She looked at him. He was not a man who said imprecise things, and he was not saying an imprecise thing now. He was saying something he had thought about and decided and was placing carefully on the table between them. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I'm asking if you'd consider it." He met her eyes. "I know what happened with Aldridge. I know you came out here because a man offered you a life, and the life wasn't real. I'm not that." He paused. "But I also know that's not sufficient reason on its own, so I'm asking if you'd consider it." She was quiet for a long moment. She was being honest with herself, which was the only way she knew how to be with decisions that mattered. She had been considering it for a while, not with urgency or romanticism, but in the way she considered all real things, carefully, practically, with attention to what was actually true about it. She knew Cole Mercer in the way you knew someone you had lived alongside through difficult things, not perfectly, not without uncertainty, but in the way that mattered. She knew he drove fence posts with 2 strokes and drove to Brixton twice without complaint, and ate burned pie with the equanimity of a man who understood what the pie represented. She knew he sat with his son in the dark and cried at night sometimes when he thought no one could hear, and had loved his wife with the particular devotion of a person who described her by her stubbornness and her laughter rather than her beauty. She knew he had said he thought being alone was the same as being without resources about Aldridge, and in saying it had demonstrated that he understood something fundamental about what she was. "It would have to be a real conversation," she said, "not just the question, what it would mean, what we each need from it, what we're each not willing to give up." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking if you'd consider it." "I'm considering it," she said. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, but the quiet release of tension that had been held carefully. "All right," he said. She looked at the remains of the pie. "It would have to be honest," she said. "Not performed, not the shape of something without the substance." "That's the only kind I'd know how to do," he said, which was true and which she appreciated precisely because it was true. "Then, yes," she said, "I'll consider it seriously." He nodded once. He looked at his coffee cup. She looked at the lamp. "You should sleep," he said after a while. "So should you." "I know. I don't always manage it." "I know," she said. "Neither do I." They stayed at the table for another few minutes in the easy quiet that had become the texture of their evenings, and then she took the pie dish to the counter, and he turned down the lamp, and they went their separate ways up the stairs, and the house settled into its night sounds, and that was all. And it was enough. Books. November came in with its serious cold. The first real frost arrived on a Tuesday morning, which she knew because she went out to the kitchen garden before breakfast and found it white and rigid, the last of the season's stubborn green gone overnight. She stood at the edge of it for a moment, looking at what the cold had done, and felt something that was not quite sadness, more like acknowledgement. The season had made its decision. She had made some of hers too. She and Cole had the real conversation, in parts, over the following 2 weeks. Not a single formal discussion, but the kind of conversation that happened in the margins of days, at meals, and on the porch, and once walking back from the barn in the late afternoon with the light going orange at the mountain's edge. They talked about the ranch and what it needed and what she knew how to do and what he did. They talked about Daniel in the way parents talked about children. Not ideally, not optimistically, but practically, with full knowledge of the difficulty and the love operating simultaneously. They talked about Sarah. That conversation happened one evening on the porch, and it was Cole who brought it up, in the straightforward way of a man who had decided something deserved to be said. "I'm not trying to replace her," he said. "Not with you, not with any of this." "I know that," Evelyn said. Daniel might sometimes need to talk about his mother, and when he does, I'll listen and I won't make it complicated," she said. "She's part of this family. She's part of him. That's not a problem." Cole looked at the mountains. "She would have liked you," he said, the same thing he'd said on the drive to Brixton those months ago. "More than I said it right the first time. She would have specifically liked you, the way you argue, the way you don't back down. She'd have found it entertaining." "High praise," Evelyn said. From her it was. She thought about a woman she would never meet who had left flower curtains in a kitchen garden and a boy with her laugh, who had answered a practical advertisement because she'd decided a man who was honest about practicality was more trustworthy than one who wrote pretty. who had been right about that. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me about her." Cole looked at her. "Thank you for asking." They were married in December, on a Saturday, in the front room of the ranch house. It was not an elaborate occasion. There was a judge, not Harlan, who was in the county seat, but a justice of the peace from the next town who arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this many times and found it meaningful each time regardless. There were witnesses. Bess, who had not been invited exactly, but had heard about it and arrived with a covered dish and the complete unapologetic manner of someone who knew when their presence was correct. Hobart and his wife, who had driven out from their place and brought their two youngest children who sat in the back of the room and were moderately well behaved. Helena had written a letter, which Evelyn read before the ceremony and put carefully in the box where she kept the things that mattered. Daniel wore his good shirt and had made an attempt at his hair that was evident and partially successful. He stood beside Cole with the posture of someone who understood this was a significant occasion and was prepared to be serious about it, and then about 4 minutes in forgot to be serious because the justice of the peace had a large and impressive mustache that was difficult not to look at. The vows were plain. She had asked for plain vows and gotten them. No elaborate language, no promises that required poetry to sustain them. Just the basic architecture, honesty, partnership, the intention of permanence, the things she could actually mean. She could actually mean them. That was the part she had checked most carefully and found to be true. Cole said his with the direct brevity that was native to him, looking at her with the steady attention she had come to know as his version of everything. Care, honesty, the full weight of a person's presence. She said hers and meant them, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something real is happening and people recognize it. Afterward, there was food, Bess's covered dish, which turned out to be a very good pot roast, and other things people had brought without coordination that somehow assembled themselves into a meal. Daniel ate enthusiastically and told the justice of the peace about the frog situation at the creek, which was ongoing and complex. Hobart's children ran in the yard for a while until the cold drove them in. Bess told Evelyn she looked well, which from Bess was approximately the equivalent of a lengthy speech. Toward the evening, when people had started making their departures and the house was beginning to quiet, Evelyn found herself standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard in the blue winter dusk. She could hear Cole in the next room with Hobart, talking about spring cattle, the kind of conversation ranchers had in December because it was the planting season. She could hear Daniel explaining something to Hobart's youngest with the authority of a child who has encountered someone younger than himself and found the experience of expertise clarifying. She looked at the yard, at the barn, the cottonwoods bare now, the creek somewhere beyond them in the dark, at the mountains which were white at the top now and would be for months. She thought about the train platform, the empty boards, the steam clearing, the absolute specific quality of that silence when she understood he was not coming. She had stood there and done the arithmetic of her situation, and it had been very bad arithmetic, every way she calculated it. She thought about the alley behind Mrs. Fitch's, a boy's arms around her waist, a word she hadn't been yet, but had not corrected. She thought about a kitchen table in the lamplight, a letter drafted and redrafted, a man eating burned pie without complaint. She thought about a drive to Brixton and back twice, and about an axe and a woodpile and fence posts driven with 2 strokes. She thought about a courtroom filling with people who had made a decision about where to stand. She had not planned any of it. She had planned Warren Aldridge and the 120 acres, and that plan had evaporated on a train platform in the first 5 minutes. Everything after that had been 1 week at a time, which was the only way she knew how to do things, and it had led here, to this kitchen window, to this particular blue dusk, to the sound of her husband in the next room and her son in the other. She used both words deliberately, both of them hers. There was a thing she had understood over the past months, working its way toward clarity the way most true things did. Slowly, through the ordinary days rather than through dramatic revelation. She had left St. Louis looking for a life that someone else was offering. What she had found instead was something harder and stranger and better. A life she had built herself, in the negative space of a plan that failed, out of the materials that were actually present rather than the ones she'd been promised. The woman who had arrived at Red Hollow with $43 and a press dress had believed, in the way people believe things they're afraid to examine too closely, that belonging was something given, that it arrived in the form of a man's offer or a family's acceptance or a place that felt right immediately. She had understood belonging as reception, as something that happened to you if the circumstances aligned. She knew better now. Belonging was not received. It was built, daily and imperfectly, out of flour on a child's hands and turned garden soil and letters drafted 3 times until they were true and testimony given without a lawyer in a courtroom full of neighbors. It was built out of the hard, small work of showing up for things that didn't ask you to be perfect, only present. She had built it. That was the thing she had not known she was doing in those first weeks at the ranch. She had been building, and it had held. The door opened behind her, and Daniel came in, moving with the energy surplus of a child who had been mostly contained for an adult occasion and was now expanding back to full capacity. "Mrs. Holloway brought cake," he announced. "There's still some. Do you want some?" "In a minute," she said. He came and stood beside her at the window. He looked out at the yard in the way children look at things, not for long, but completely. "It looks the same," he said. "Outside." "It does," she agreed. "But it's different," he said, with the particular certainty of a child who has decided something is true. She looked at him. He was looking out at the yard with his small, serious face, in his good shirt with the collar slightly askew. "Yes," she said. "It is." He seemed satisfied with this. He leaned against her side briefly and without ceremony, the way he did things, completely, and then past them, moving on. Then he straightened up. "I'm going to have cake now," he said. "Save me some," she said. He went. She heard him in the other room, heard Cole's voice, and then his, and then laughter. Cole's, which was still relatively rare and therefore still worth noting, the kind of sound that came from a real place. She stood at the window a moment longer. Outside, the dark was coming on fully, and the mountains had gone from blue to black at their bases, the snow at the top still faintly visible in the last light. The cottonwoods stood in their winter bare shapes, patient and sure of the spring. The yard was ordinary, mud-frozen, barn light visible through the crack in the door where the latch needed attention, a tool someone had left leaning against the fence and forgotten, imperfect and present and entirely hers. She turned away from the window and went to join her family, and the door closed behind her, and the cold stayed outside where it belonged, and the lamp was burning in the kitchen, and the cake was apparently very good, because Daniel was already on his second piece when she got there, and the argument about whether he was allowed a third would wait until he asked, and the evening still had hours left in it, ordinary and sufficient and her own. That was enough. That was, she had learned, exactly and completely enough. The ranch held its ground under the winter sky, and the lights in its windows were warm and visible from the road, and anyone passing in the dark might have looked up and seen them, and felt, without knowing why, that here was a place where people had chosen each other, and made something from the choosing, and intended to keep it. Which was the truth. Which was, at the end of it all, the only story worth telling.